Hello, doctors. I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff of EZ QME Continuing Education. Welcome to this week's presentation. You may recall, as the world was turned on its ear by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, this event forced us to make some really drastic changes in our everyday and professional lives, including the California workers' compensation system. So as a result, the use of telehealth services in the workers' compensation system of California increased dramatically in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was mostly driven by a growing demand for telehealth services as a result of the stay-at-home orders in 2020 and the surges of the COVID-19 infections. Although the demand for those telehealth services has decreased after the height of the pandemic, a demand still does exist. And there have even been recent discussion in the workers' compensation system as to how we could implement these changes when it comes to in-person QME examinations versus telehealth. However, today we'll just discuss how popular the telehealth services have become in California workers' compensation system to date. Below you'll find the sources that I referenced when producing this presentation. Feel free to copy and paste these links into your browser if you'd like to read more about the WCIRB, and particularly the subject of today's discussion. First, some backgrounds and definitions. As I had previously mentioned, the use of telehealth services in the California workers' compensation system has increased dramatically in response to the COVID pandemic. An expanded list of the telehealth procedure codes was published by the CMS, or the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and was actually adopted by the California Division of Workers' Compensation, allowing these procedures to be reimbursed at the same rate as in-person services, effective March 2020 and continuing further. Now, the adoption of these CMS lists intends to facilitate the injured workers continuing to receive the medical care while adhering to the public health guidelines that were made. This study is an initial review of the characteristics of the telehealth services provided in the workers' compensation in the system of California, and how the claims involving telehealth services compare to claims involving only in-person medical services. So for the purpose of this study, the telehealth services are defined as medical services provided via synchronous, real-time audio and/or video communication, including those in the CMS's list of telehealth procedural codes. So let's get started. So first of all, the research question they posed was, what are the overall trends and patterns of the telehealth services? So the trend of the medical payments for the services are provided here. And the share of the medical payments for telehealth services increased sharply in the second quarter of 2020 with the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic and subsequently the stay-at-home orders. Not surprisingly, the increase in telehealth payments was driven by increased utilization of the telehealth services, of course. Despite the gradual decline in the subsequent quarters after 2020 height, the share of medical payments for telehealth services has remained significantly higher than those during the pre-pandemic period. As you see in these statistics, 2018 to 2022, a drastic increase. So let's start with some comparisons. Here we see the use of the telehealth services compared to in-person services. Now, the use of the telehealth services increased significantly in the second quarter of 2020, as I previously mentioned, and has gradually declined in the following quarters. Despite this decline, though, the telehealth usage by the second quarter of 22 remained more than 30-fold higher than that of the pre-pandemic period, largely driven by the increased use of EM, or evaluation and management, telehealth services. In contrast to the spike in telehealth utilization, the use of in-person services dipped during the early months of the pandemic, but returned to the pre-pandemic level by the third quarter of 2020. These values represent the number of medical services relative to all claims with at least one paid service for each quarter. And look at the differences here. Okay, here we have the evaluation and management services, mostly office visits, were the leading type of telehealth services even before the pandemic, and yet the share of telehealth services for the office visits increased to over 80% during the pandemic. Its utilization pattern drives the overall pattern of telehealth utilization. Some of these EM services shifted from being provided in person to via telehealth, especially during the early months of the pandemic. This led to a sharp drop in the number of in-person EM services in the second quarter of 2020, and lower than pre-pandemic level utilization in the subsequent quarters. Now, these values represent the number of EM services relative to all the claims with at least one paid service for each quarter. Again, the comparisons are drastic. Moving on to the types of physician services with the highest share of provided telehealth. You won't be surprised at this, but almost 40% of the psychotherapies and psychiatric evaluations were provided via telehealth, the highest among the physician services. This is potentially because the teletherapies are convenient and can provide additional comfort and privacy to the patient seeking mental health treatments. Follow-up visits are the leading EM services provided by telehealth, potentially due to the convenience of the virtual visits and the fact that the limited in-person intervention may be needed during the follow-up visit. These values represent the number of telehealth services relative to all of the medical services for each physician service type. As you can see, psychotherapy is 37%, human behavior or health behavior is 26%, and follow-up office visits are followed by 12%. Medical care provided by psychologists, psychiatric doctors, and neurologists make up the largest share of the telehealth services, about 14%. And that is consistent with the leading type of telehealth services. However, physician specialists, primary care providers, and surgeons also used telehealth services during the pandemic, most likely for the services or follow-up visits not requiring an in-person contact. Values represent here the number of telehealth services relative to all the medical service for each provider type. As you see, we do go from the psychology of 14% down to the surgeon at 2.5%. The top 5 regions in the state of California that have a relatively high share of these telehealth service payments are the medium to large metropolitan areas, while the Central Valley and the other remaining regions in California with a lower share of telehealth payments, they tend to be more rural. The Bay Area has a much higher share of payments for telehealth services than the LA area, likely due to more accessible telehealth technologies for both the injured workers and the providers and different industry mix of workers. We'll get into that in a second. Now, the region's based on a 3-digit zip code that reported on each of the medical transactions and represents the medical provider's location. Now, as part of this information, the research question now changes. And they asked, well, how do the claims involving telehealth services compare to claims involving only in-person services? So some key definitions here. For the purpose of this study, the claims with telehealth services are defined as the claims involving a mix of telehealth and in-person services or only telehealth services. The claims with an in-person services are defined as claims that do not receive any telehealth services but receive strictly in-person services. Both of these claims excluded claims involving any inpatient services to address comparability issues, given that the inpatient care typically cannot be provided via telehealth. Now, these comparisons between the two groups of claims focuses on the first year of the claim experience. Addressing the age of the workers? Well, overall, the median age of the injured workers is similar between those with the telehealth services and those with in-person services only. However, the pattern is slightly different for injured workers who have low back pain or mental or behavioral disorders, which are the leading medical diagnoses for these claims with telehealth services. For both the diagnoses, work workers using telehealth services tend to be younger than those using in-person services only. This may be partly due to a younger patients being more familiar with telehealth technologies. And this source is from the WCIRB medical transaction data for the accident years 2020 and 2021. Now let's go into the industry sectors. As you see here, the retail trade industry has the highest share of claims with telehealth services as compared to the other industries. The manufacturing industry, on the other hand, has the lower share of the claims with telehealth services. Injured workers in healthcare are also more likely to use the telehealth services, potentially because healthcare workers may be more familiar with and have a better access to telehealth services themselves. This source was also taken from the transaction data from accident years 2020 and 2021. So now we're going to go into the actual medical diagnoses and their share of the medical payments. First of all, overall, the leading medical diagnoses for claims with telehealth services and claims with strictly in-person services are very similar. Claims involving dislocation and sprains, tissue disorders, and multiple injuries account for more than half of the medical payments for the claims using the telehealth services. Claims involving dislocation and sprain and minor wounds have a lower share of telehealth payments, potentially because more in-person care is needed for those types of injuries. These values represent the share of the medical payments by medical diagnosis for the claims of the telehealth services or for the claims with in-person services only. So we see this drastically, dislocation and sprains down to minor injuries for telehealth services, a big difference there. This may come at no surprise to you, but more than 1 in 5 of the claims involving the mental and behavioral disorders received medical care via telehealth. The pattern is consistent, and it shows that the psychiatric services as the leading type of telehealth service. Now, claims involving multiple injuries or soft tissue disorders also tend to seek medical treatments via telehealth in conjunction with in-person care to better manage the more complex medical conditions. Claims involving chronic pain conditions, such as carpal tunnel syndrome and low back pain, are also most likely to use telehealth services. If you see here, mental health and behavioral, 21%, low back pain, 14%, and all others, 7%. Of all the 3 leading medical diagnoses in the study, indemnity claims or claims paid out with telehealth evaluation and management as the first service have on average a lower number of medical services, including both the telehealth and in-person services per claim than those with in-person evaluation management as the first service, potentially because those who use the in-person evaluation management as their first service may be more severe injuries and need more intensive care. And this is also brought out by the medical transaction data for accident years 2020, 2021. However, the CT claims are excluded from this. And finally, of the 3 leading medical diagnoses in the study, indemnity claims that have telehealth evaluation management as their first service are much more likely to receive subsequent evaluation management services via telehealth, as compared to only roughly 30% of the claims with in-person evaluation management as their first service. This is all taken from medical transaction data for that accident years of 2020 and 2021. And again, the CT claims are excluded. Well, it's no surprise that we had a lot of statistics, a lot of numbers to deal with here in this presentation, but in conclusion here, I wanted to mention that it seemed that some of these changes that were implemented in response to the 2020 pandemic are becoming more accepted as the new norm even today in 2024. I don't mean to alarm you, my fellow QMEs, but I am also hearing through the grapevine that they're discussing some possible implementation of more telehealth services when it comes to QME examinations as well. In my opinion, the thought of a telehealth PQME examination, aside from a psych exam, is preposterous, but I don't make those decisions. So I'll keep you appraised of any concrete developments in this potentially crazy idea, in my opinion. Well, doctors, I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff, and I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join me in today's presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I do look forward to sharing other interesting subjects as they relate to the topics involving work compensation in the state of California. And then, until next time, thank you.